So here's our first lecture on Italian Renaissance. These are really the artists that lead us up to the true birth of the Renaissance, which happens around the year 1400. So we'll look at some work from the 1200s, the 1300s, and then, of course, we'll end with the work of Ghiberti, which really is kind of the kickoff point of the Renaissance. Again, the slides for most lectures, the first guide slide will kind of show you exactly what's being covered in that particular lecture, but the things in red are the ones you want to watch out for. Those are the ones to know for the test, for the purposes of writing essays or discussion boards, what have you. And they're also, the vocab terms usually will turn up in red as well. So some key places to look at in the Renaissance: think about the culture of Italy not being a single country with a single capital and a firm border the way we think of countries today. You can almost think of people as being more citizens of an individual city, like Rome, Siena, Florence, or Venice. So the people were really kind of almost living in city-states, and those city-states were, of course, related, and they had a language in common, and, of course, religion in common as well. But it was almost more that you were a citizen of Florence than that you were Italian, if that makes sense. Some of the names of artists are also kind of interesting for us to know about. We know most of the artists really by nicknames or by stage names, if you will. The numbers of artists who have become famous for a single name, you could kind of think of them as being similar to pop stars today. Adele or Ariana, you know who I'm referring to by a single first name. And so some of the artists are known that way. Some of them are known by names that are variations on the town where they lived or worked, and some are flat out nicknames. So, for example, Masaccio is one of my personal favorites. Maso is just a shortened form of Tommaso or Thomas, so that's like saying Tommy, but Accio is the suffix that indicates ugliness. So Masaccio basically means that his nickname is Little Ugly Tommy. It's kind of funny, right? Paolo Uccello's nickname implies that he's bird-like. Castagno is named for his birthplace as opposed to his actual name. Donatello is his actual name, but sort of softened into a nickname. So you get a sense of how people became known over time. But what's really interesting is that in the Italian Renaissance, for the first time in a long time, we have artists becoming famous, whether by their own name, a stage name, so to speak, what have you. They are known for their own unique individual abilities, as opposed to the way we saw art in the Middle Ages being done by craftspeople who were not considered to be quite as important. A lot of the work in the Middle Ages was done almost anonymously. So this is a really good example of what the work of the 1200s into the early 13s was like. This is the work of Cimabue. Cimabue is perhaps the best example I can give you of an artist on the verge of starting the Renaissance. So he carries over traditions from the Middle Ages, in particular the style that has become known as the Italo-Byzantine style, or also known as the Greek manner. This is very much the style of Eastern Orthodox Catholicism, and it really does come to us after the Roman Empire has split in two halves. The east half, the Byzantine half, favors this golden background, shallow space, kind of repetitive form, and of course a focus on the Madonna and Child motif. We also see with Cimabue a use of what some people refer to loosely as shading in reverse, which is generally speaking where you have dark fabric that highlights have kind of been applied on top of, as opposed to really delving into a highlight, a transition into a fold and a deeper shadow. You can definitely see that here in this particular altarpiece. Now these are really quite large. They don't seem as big as they are on the screen, but this piece is over 12 feet in height. Most of them are painted in tempera on wooden panels, so they're big and they're heavy. And you can see that Cimabue's style is pretty much the same. He does the same type of subject. But again, artists in the Renaissance are working for patrons. They're working for people who are paying them to make art, and they are specifying what it is that they want them to make. So they're specifying, I want an altar, I want a Madonna and Child. So it kind of makes sense that you would see some repeated themes. Cimabue's work very often is seen as a transition to the Renaissance because he does pay more attention to human anatomy. It's not perfect, but you can see it here in the legs of the figures flagellating the figure of Christ, and you can see that in the figure of Christ himself, of course, as well. You can see that it's a little bit hit or miss, though, right? Some exaggeration, there's some kind of odd transitions in the proportions in the bodies in some of the works across his career. So Cimabue is also known for decorations in churches, and that becomes a really important theme throughout the Renaissance, is that artists would be vying for trying to get commissions to do mural paintings, frescoes on the walls of churches. Now, in the Byzantine tradition, this blue ceiling and kind of painted stars, or sometimes faces of angels, is very, very much what the church ceiling is meant to look like, kind of opening to heaven, and we'll see that begin to change over time. You can see Cimabue doesn't understand 1- and 2-point perspective perfectly, but he's trying to get there. So again, it's the beginnings of the Renaissance. Pietro Cavallini is another transitional artist, and you can see that he's really also using some of that deep gold background. This happens to be a mosaic, but it gives you some of the same feelings that you saw in the earlier work by Cimabue. You can also see a theme that's going to continue throughout the Renaissance, this subject of the Annunciation, the announcing angel Gabriel, announcing to Mary that she will be the mother of the child of God. And you can see God the Father, you can see the Holy Spirit, you can see that this is aiming toward her womb. Cavallini's work definitely starts to have more solidity, more three-dimensionality. You can really see that in the articulation in the toes and the fingers in this fresco. Duccio is another artist who's very often paired up with Cimabue. You can see that there's a real similarity between their two styles and in terms of their subjects. So you can imagine that a Renaissance patron would be kind of expecting art to look a certain way and to look like this. There's that shading in reverse, right? The highlight on top of the fabric. But Duccio really begins to break away from that mold and begins to give us figures that feel a little bit more fully three-dimensional, a little bit less of that kind of stamped out repetitive figure just overlapping on top of one another that we saw a lot in the Renaissance. We're beginning to see this a little bit more fully fleshed out, three-dimensional in the work of Duccio. This is the back of this altarpiece, which sadly was cut down and the pieces have been sold off, so this is a digital recreation. But when this piece was first installed, when this altarpiece was delivered from the art studio to the church, it literally shut the city down. They had a procession and a day-long festival celebrating the incredible, believable, realistic artwork that was being installed in the church. And you can see how much that style has changed. You can see a highlight fading into shadow on the robes, the figure more fully three-dimensional in terms of the mother and child. There's a little bit less repetition of blank, similar, exactly the same faces in these saints that are venerating them in this remarkable setting here. So Duccio's work really does start to give us what the Renaissance is going to be about, and you can see this kind of underpainting green in a lot of the figures. That green undertone with a flesh tone on top is a complementary color contrast that actually makes the figures feel a little bit more three-dimensional, and a flesh tone color on top of that green is going to make those figures feel ever more dimensional. This is the work of Simone Martini. And again, you can see that the fabric is being treated in a way that feels much more like there's a body underneath it, a fully three-dimensional form inside of that space. more work by Martini. He's probably best known for us for this Annunciation scene that does have that really deep, deep gold background, and also has this incredible carved framing system that really emphasizes this Gothic decorative quality as well. You can see the angel Gabriel announcing to her, and you can literally see his words, "Hail, favored one, the Lord is with you," is like coming out of his mouth across the painting toward her. So you can literally read the painting. A piece to know for the test is Ambrosio Lorenzetti's Government in the City and in the Country. This is an incredible wall mural that is 46 feet wide. It was done for the Palazzo Pubblica in Siena. Think of it kind of as the city hall or town hall where laws are going to be enacted and where the governing body is going to meet to make decisions. You can see the perspective's not perfect, but it's really improved. It's really almost dead on. And the theme of this mural is really to remind the public leaders what their job is. Their job is to make this a functioning city that's a good place to live, people prosper. And so you can see construction going on, you can see commerce happening, you can see people happily going about their days. But as you look out the gate, this just continues on. This is good government in the city and the country. This shows you the surrounding countryside. Right above the entrance to the city is a statue that is the she-wolf suckling Romulus and Remus, the mythical founders of Rome, and they are paired up with this angelic figure who is carrying a gallows and this scroll that reminds you that you're welcome in the city, that you need to obey the laws or there will be consequences. So there's really kind of an almost ominous feeling there. Can you see her telling you, okay, you're welcome here, but don't break the law? It's really kind of a funny example. And that's the statue of Romulus and Remus right there. You can just barely see that next to her foot there. This is a literal reference straight back to classical antiquity and classical mythology. That gives you a sense of scale for the whole thing. That's good government in the city. There's the countryside. There are the good governors on one of the short walls, and on the opposite short wall are the bad governors. So there's our good ones. Here's our bad ones. Take a look at this. The allegory of bad government and the effects of bad government are terrible. You can see dead bodies in the streets. You can see things falling apart. And then the actual bad governor has a goat and a goat-hooved demon beside him in the background. And just in case you can't tell that he's bad, you can see the effects on the country. You can see he's even wearing horns on his head. So there's clearly an over-the-top allegory happening in this image. This is the brother, Pietro Lorenzetti, and the Lorenzetti brothers were really well known as early precursors to the Renaissance for creating these believable illusionistic three-dimensional spaces in their work. So this is the frame to this edge, but this detail here creates the feeling of a ribbed vault over this space where we see the birth of the Virgin. That's her mother shortly after giving birth to Mary right there. Giotto is the next artist to know, and he really is a great transition for us from the style of Cimabue into becomes the Renaissance. If you look at that kind of shading in reverse in the Byzantine style, you can really see highlight changing into a gradient fade into a shadow across all the fabric, but especially in the chest. If you look across the breasts of the Virgin here, you can really see highlight and shadow creating the feeling that there's a body inside of and underneath that fabric. She also occupies a more believable space. In this case, we have this arch over these saints underneath that turns into the same curve of the steps to her throne, but if she were to step down, she would theoretically fall into this empty space. Here we have none of that kind of spatial anomaly happening at all. The figures of the supporting angels also feel like they're standing on believable ground instead of somehow standing on top of each other's shoulders. So Giotto really is one of the artists who create the true beginnings of the Renaissance for us. There is a legend that Giotto was more or less a sort of child prodigy who was discovered and trained by Cimabue, and so he kind of takes Cimabue's work and carries it forward. You can really see in this detail shot that idea of the body underneath the fabric, and that's really a different phase of painting from what we've seen up to this point. Giotto's work, we can sometimes use a term you won't find in every art history, but I kind of like this idea of the clothed nude. It is the implication that the artist understands the anatomy underneath the fabric in order to put fabric on top of the body to clothe it in a way that feels believable. This is some of Giotto's most important painting. This is the Arena Chapel in Padua in Italy. And you can see the ceiling has that blue field with stars, but the painting to know from that chapel is the Lamentation. It's a remarkable painting in which we see, instead of the characters of the story almost as actors looking toward us, they seem to not even be aware of us whatsoever. We're looking through a window into their space. We see their backs, for instance. We really haven't seen that in the Middle Ages much at all. We see figures fully from the back, in profile, in three-quarter, and you also see the angels kind of zooming toward us in space in foreshortened poses, like they're coming toward us from a background space. You've got the beginnings of really believable landscape happening as well, and this incredibly intense emotion. You can clearly see highlight and shadow following in a consistent way. The light source is consistent across the whole image. It's fairly bright, but there's a single light source from the upper left throwing shadow to the lower right. We can identify the figures of the Madonna, St. John the Evangelist, and Mary Magdalene quite easily in that image as well. So Giotto's really known for these believable scenes in which it feels as if you're looking into a window into a fully three-dimensional space. You're really using that of light and shadow to create believable outdoor scenes with landscape as well. Another really important artist for us, truly at the beginning of the Renaissance now, is Masaccio, again, Little Ugly Tommy. Masaccio's Holy Trinity is one to know for the test. That's this piece here to the left, completed in 1428. It's an important one for us because it really shows perfect one-point linear perspective. You can see the lines between the coffers and the ceiling would all meet up at the same point, at a focal point at the horizon. This is the full painting, so you can see that it appears as though you're looking at a sarcophagus or a above ground coffin, but in fact that's all paint. It also looks as though you're looking at the patrons looking into a deeper space in which they're seeing a vision of the crucifixion attended by John and Mary, and you see above them the figure of God the Father and God the Holy Spirit. So this is obviously not a depiction of the actual scene of the crucifixion, which of course took place outside. This is what we might call a sacra conversazione, a sacred conversation, a scene in which devout people are having a vision of heaven and saints are venerating events or characters straight from the Bible. It's kind of a remarkable thing. You can see this overlay really gives you the extended lines or orthogonals of the leading lines, perspective lines of the perspective, leading us to a vanishing point at the horizon. That is roughly eye level. If you were to stand in front of the painting today, your eye level would be roughly in this general zone. So it's a very believable three-dimensional illusion of space. In this section of fresco, you can see a line here where the color changes slightly. That generally can be seen up close on most fresco paintings. The way a fresco is done is that plaster is applied to the wall, allowed to almost dry, and then the paint is applied. So there is usually a detectable line, especially up close, where you can see where the artist has stopped work for one day before going on to the next section. Larger sections of single colors, easy to do in a quick amount of time. Smaller sections where there's a lot of detail and changes in value, obviously you couldn't do as much in a single day. This is a sense of that chapel where we just saw the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the garden. This is the Brancacci Chapel. And the next piece by Masaccio to know is the tribute money from that Brancacci Chapel. It gives us not only the linear perspective, have what we call atmospheric or landscape perspective, where things closer to you are darker, larger, in greater detail, and they get smaller, lighter, less detailed, and grayer as we go back in the background. And this piece also tells a pretty remarkable story, but it tells three parts of the story at the same time. You actually have a beginning, middle, and end happening all simultaneously. In the center, Christ is confronted by the Roman tax collector, and you notice he's in more Renaissance garb, whereas Christ and the disciples are in typical Roman Empire style togas. The Christ and disciple figures are being asked to pay the taxes that they owe to the government. And of course, they don't have money, they've been giving it away to the poor. So Christ instructs Peter to go fish. And Peter goes fishing. He opens the mouth of the fish that he catches and finds gold coins, which he then uses here to pay off the tax collector. So the tax collector appears twice. Peter appears at the beginning, the middle of the story, and at the end. Definitely we know about the canon of proportion, the 7 heads tall, and how much the Middle Ages kind of diverted from that particular approach to proportion, and how it emphasized the storytelling through symbol as opposed to through naturalistic physical detail. So again, just to kind of remind you of what we lost when we went from the style of Greece and Rome into the Middle Ages, the Renaissance is trying to combine this level of storytelling and piety with the reality of the style of Greece and of Rome. We certainly can see some of that happening here in the carvings of Nicola Pisano. This is a pulpit carved in relatively high relief, so you can see really deep shadow underneath, but you can see the heads are still a little bit too big for the body. That's Nicola Pisano, and this is his son. And you can see just in one generation the change in the challenging level of composition, proportion, dynamism, movement that's beginning to be possible as we move into the Renaissance. You can see it also here in the sculpture of damned souls, much more detailed here in these demons and tortured souls. Very remarkable. I also want to think a little bit about social structure here. This is the work of Nanni di Banco, which he was a sculptor who got the commission to create a sculpture for the Sculptors Guild. And so what you're seeing here are stone carvers at their craft, and then their patron saints. So all of this would have been created by Nanni di Banco for this niche on the outside of the Or San Michele in Florence, which was an open-air market. And so these are Roman-era Christians who refused to make sculptures of the gods of the pantheon of Rome, and so they were put to death. So they are executed for refusing to do these kind of what they would consider pagan gods. This is the Or San Michele. It's been bricked in since, but this would have been an important city center, meeting place, open-air market. And the guilds are essentially the governing bodies for the different trades. So there would be a draper's guild that would be for weavers and cloth dyers. So people who aspired to have a business would try to achieve membership within the guilds. The guilds set prices. They decided upon membership. It could make or break your career to be excluded from membership from the guild. It's sort of a cross between a governing body, a trade union, and a service club. So if you think about it, the guilds are really integral to economic life especially in Florence, but throughout Italy at this point. And there was a painters guild, there was a sculptors guild as well. So to be a professional, you had to achieve membership with one of these trade governing bodies. In Florence, in particular, we have a really important building right in front of the main cathedral. This is the baptistry building, separate building just for the baptisms. The original doors on this building date from 1330. They were designed by Andrea Pisano. They tell the story of Christ, especially focusing on the baptism of Christ. There's an entire program of imagery, and it is laid out within these frames, which are known as quatrefoils, 4 lobes. So they're very much in a medieval style. Well, as we approached the turn of the century, the city elders decided that they wanted to have more contemporary, more modern art on the main entrance doors. There's actually 3 entrances, one that faces the church, and then one on either side, no entrance on the back. So these were the original main doors. They were going to be moved to the side and new put in their place. So the city elders decided to have a competition. There's the baptism scene. And so they held a competition kind of similar to our reality show competitions, believe it or not, sort of like an American Idol, if you will. The artists were tasked with making sculptures to prove that they could not only do the work, they had to be able to sculpt in wax, to create molds, to successfully cast those molds in bronze. But they also were all asked to do the same story. So they were told to create an image of the sacrifice of Isaac. So Abraham is confronted by God. God requests a sacrifice from him, and Abraham, of course, says that he'll do it. And then God says he wants the sacrifice not to be an animal, but to be his firstborn son, Isaac. And so it's the classic tale of the test of faith. Abraham feels that he has to obey God, but he doesn't want to kill his son, but he's forced to make this choice between his own family and the word of God. So, of course, he decides he has to follow God's law, so he takes his son to an altar stone on a hill. Some servants go with him. He is about to plunge the knife into Isaac's neck when the angel of the Lord appears and tells him it was a test of faith. God does not demand the sacrifice of the son. They sacrifice a sheep instead, but it proves that Abraham is a good follower of God. So that's what they were meant to depict. You had to include Abraham, Isaac, and the angel, of course, the altar, the sacrificial lamb, then also 2 servants and a donkey for carrying everything up to the altar. So these are 2 of the remaining original pieces. There were 7 finalists. These were the top 2 finalists. On the left, you have the work of Brunelleschi. On the right, you have the work of Ghiberti. And if you really look at them, you can kind of see the Renaissance happening. This whole image is perfectly fine as it is, but it doesn't have a whole lot of drama. The angel has already seized Abraham's arm and stopped him from killing his son. The drama is essentially over. In fact, also the composition's kind of static as well. The whole thing is divided in half here, which makes our figures kind of short and fills up half the space with the least important figures, the servants, the donkey. I've always thought it was kind of funny that this figure looks like he's stopped to tie his shoe, even though there's a murder about to take place. You would think that that might be more important to them, to like not tie the shoe, but try to stop this from happening. In this composition, it's divided vertically, which gives us much more room for the figures overall. There's far more energy in the way that Abraham is posed here. The knife is about to go across the son's throat, and the angel is bursting onto the scene but hasn't arrived yet, so will he make it in time? There's tension here in what's happening. The rocky outcrop divides our servants and donkey from the main scene, so it also makes more sense that they're not directly horrified by what's happening. We have, of course, our sacrificial lamb on hand just in case. So quite obviously the winner of this competition is Ghiberti. So this is his actual original casting. It's what won him the competition. So ironically, Brunelleschi, finishing second, decides to stop working in sculpture completely. He completely gives up as an artist. That's really what the Renaissance was all about, in a way, was achieving the absolute very best work that was possible and not accepting anything other than the absolute best. So here's the layout of the baptistry. This is the east door. This would be the door facing church. So that's where Pisano's original doors were. They were moved to the side. Ghiberti's doors were here. Then a couple decades later, there was an outcry. They wanted him to make another set. So they moved his first set from the main entrance to the north side and asked him to complete another set for the east entrance. And those were nicknamed by none other than Michelangelo himself, the Gates of Paradise. Michelangelo said that these sculptures were so beautiful, these doors were so perfect, that they were the equal of what could serve as the entrance to heaven, or Gates of Paradise. So this is the original concept for the first set of doors by Ghiberti. He still was forced to work within that quatrefoil format. This is his second set, in which he broke free and insisted on being able to do rectangular formats, which allowed him to tell this entire remarkable story of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, all the way to the life of Moses, in believable relief sculpture, projecting slightly to extremely from a flat background that creates this illusion of three-dimensional space here in the story of Adam and Eve in the garden, all the way through this particular section, Jacob and Esau, which has totally believable three-dimensional, one perspective rendered in relief sculpture. It's just an absolutely remarkable accomplishment, and it really is the full-on birth of the Renaissance. So we can see that this sense of drama, proportion, and storytelling, the need for the work to be more and more believable, is really at the heart of what the Renaissance is all about. So don't feel too bad for Brunelleschi. Ghiberti defeated him in the sculptural competition for the baptistry. Brunelleschi instead turned his attention to architecture, and he got the commission to complete the dome for the cathedral that the baptistry sits in front of. And in fact, no one calls this church by its real name. It's universally known as Il Duomo, the dome. He literally made the largest dome since the ancient world. And it's not just a half-circular dome, it's actually a pointed arch dome with this remarkable lantern at the top. It is constructed in such a way that there's an inner and an outer dome. It is a massive achievement. This was the original plan. It was the final result. Really an incredible, incredible achievement. He also laid the bricks of the dome in a really brilliant way in a herringbone pattern instead of straight across in horizontal rows, which would mean that any crack would eventually hit, if it was coming straight down this way, would hit a horizontal stop. It creates an incredible amount of stability for that shape, and you can see that herringbone pattern in this close-up photograph as well. So Brunelleschi turned away from sculpture and toward architecture and became by far the leading architect of his day.